and welcome to Escape Studios webinar on our professional courses, in particular the Maya Core course. I'll be the presenter tonight. My name is Mark Spevik and I'm the head of 3D here at Escape, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the courses and also give you a very quick introduction into Maya over the next hour to give you a kind of a taster to our teaching style and information that we might put in there. So I'm going to start with some slides explaining about the course, and then we'll have a little look into Maya, and then at the end of that we'll have a little section where you can ask some questions and I'll try my best to answer them for you. So let's start first off with our show reel. So there we go, that's the Escape showreel, showcasing some of the work that has mostly been done on the professional courses. So there's a mixture of 2D and 3D and some animation in there as well. So who are we? Who is Escape Studios? So a very brief introduction. We've been teaching high-end visual effects courses since 2002. That's when the company was founded by Dominic Davenport here in Shepherd's Bush, or near to Shepherd's Bush, in fact. And it was founded because there was no sort of education providing the particular skills needed for high-end computer graphics at that time. Obviously, we've been in business since then, and we're doing quite well. And it was in 2003 that Pearson PLC noticed what we were doing, and they wanted to create sort of a big arts university in London. So they decided to acquire us and make us part of that. So that's where Escape is now. And that's really good, actually, because it means our course is a lot more accessible. We're able to offer our same professional course in many more flavours to suit everybody's kind of needs. The course is also run by professional industry tutors, people that have worked normally for at least 5 years in the industry before they come and teach with us to pass on their wonderful knowledge. For example, I've worked in movies for about 12 years for sort of Terry Gilliam and Double Negative and Moving Picture Company on various Hollywood movies. Our head of 2D, Davy Stein, she worked for MPC and DNEG and quite a few others in Soho, again on lots of Hollywood movies. And our animation tutor, Alex Williams, has worked on, again, Hollywood movies, The Iron Giant being one of them. But his dad, Richard Williams, is well known for making Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So we've got quite an esteemed list of tutors there, all willing to pass on their knowledge to anybody that comes through the doors. On top of that, we have industry partners that we liaise quite a lot with. We do have a mentoring program where a company may mentor your course when you come here. We say may, they are very busy with their schedules. We do have good relationships with them, and we often do have them mentoring, but there are occasional courses where it just doesn't work out. But most of the time they do mentor, which is really good. And often that can sometimes lead to opportunities. It was a couple of years ago, but there was a class here actually that were doing quite well, and they were being mentored by Electric Theatre Collective. And they in fact nearly employed the whole class. They had a job coming up, and the particular skills they were looking for were right there, and they said, why don't we just give you a chance, which is brilliant. So let's talk about the course options. We're talking about the Maya Core course. We actually offer a 12-week course, a 12-week full-time course and a 20-week part-time course. The 12-week full-time course actually encompasses the core component, which we're talking about tonight, and the advanced component, which we're not going to talk about tonight. We're going to do that in a separate webinar, so we'll look at more advanced features of Maya then. So that's split into 2 6-week chunks. We're going to talk about the first 6 weeks of that. But the 20 weeks part-time course is the full lot put together. That's spread over, that's 2 evenings a week, and that's for people that can't devote their full time to study the professional courses. The full time does mean full time. You know, you're in Escape from 10 till sort of 5, 6 every day for the either 12 weeks while you complete the various modules. But the part time, like I say, is just 2 nights a week of 3 hours each, so it's a little bit easier to digest. We teach industry standard software. A lot of people want to know the kind of software that we teach here. Obviously we teach Maya, well maybe not obviously, we teach Maya. Maya is the 3D software that's used in most sort of film and high-end TV production places, which is why it's our tool of choice, because that's where we're sort of training you to go to work for the moving picture company or Double Negative or people exactly like that. There are various other softwares that are used, and they're all bonuses, but it's mostly Maya that we choose. Now, there's a software called Arnold. That's actually the renderer, the thing that makes the pictures that you finally see from the 3D software, because the 3D software kind of builds the object, and the renderer kind of paints the final image. Arnold is the name of the renderer that we use here. Again, an industry standard renderer used by a lot of production and TV facilities. There's quite a few different renderers out there, but these days, the way they're designed, they all work in a very similar way. So once you kind of understand how one works, it's very easy to pick up other ones. We chose Arnold, because it comes with Maya, and it's just much easier to use and understand what rendering's about, as opposed to a particular renderer. We also, on the 12-week component, the more advanced bit, which we'll talk about in a later webinar, we teach Mudbox, which is a digital sculpting program. This allows you to sort of interact with your models in a more sort of intuitive way with brushes and pushing and pulling, as opposed to drawing curves and manipulating points, which is traditional Maya sort of workflow. We then also teach Photoshop, which I'm sure most people would be familiar with, which is the #1 image editing program, again used industry-wide. And again, on the advanced component, we also teach a little bit of compositing. There is a separate compositing course that runs alongside the 3D course, because most people either choose to do compositing or they'll generate the elements with 3D. But Nuke is the compositing software, so a lot of the time a 3D artist will need to see their work and how it would look at the end without disturbing or going into the cost of using a compositing department. So yeah, the compositing software Nuke allows you to put the 3D elements and mix them in with the backplate. Think of it like Photoshop that you can animate, a bit like After Effects if people are familiar with that. So we teach you a little bit of compositing and sort of image manipulation for that, which is always useful. And then again on the advanced component, the second 6 weeks, which I'll go into more detail in a later webinar, is 3D Equalizer. This again is the industry standard, what we call tracking program. The tracking program is where we reverse engineer how the camera that shot the footage once moved, so we can reproduce that camera inside Maya, and then when we render our 3D through that camera, it looks as if it was shot with the original camera, and then it's easy to composite. So this is how we put together those moving shots that you see in films and movies. A still image is much easier, but with a moving shot you need programs like 3D Equalizer in order to help you put it all together and make it look like it was all shot with that one camera. So that's quite a fun one to learn as well, taking it to the next step. Just to reiterate again the differences between the first 6 weeks and the second 6 weeks. The first 6 weeks we take you through the basic 3D pipeline, which is modeling, texturing, lighting and rendering, and we do that in a still image. And then the second 6 weeks we repeat that process, look at more advanced techniques, but you also learn 3D Equalizer and compositing, and you do that in a moving shot, much more like you would see in the workflow of a Hollywood movie. So you get to do the process twice, but the second half you get to do it in a moving shot, because otherwise it's too much to take on all at once, and it's quite important to make your stuff look good and real and then move it into a shot. So that's why it's formed into those two sort of halves. Let's go on to the next section here, which is the benefits. If you do come and do a course here, just a little sidetrack, there are some extra bits that you get around that. For example, you know, we would like everyone to do a free online primer course that we give you before you start studying here, because there's certain skills and things that we'd like you to have when you come through the door. Obviously, people can and do or don't and whatever, and we teach everybody from a certain base level. So for some people that have done this stuff before, the first few lessons might be a bit repetitive, which is good. It's always good to go over the stuff you think you know. I mean, personally, I still look at all the basic videos and things because there's always tips and different ways of thinking about it that you pick up more once you have actually got some experience. So we start from a very lowish level, but we still like people to come and feel familiar with it. So we'd like you to do this primer course just so we kind of know roughly what everybody knows, and it gets everybody on a much even level to start with, which is good fun actually, because you know it gets you into it. You do that through access to our VLE, our virtual learning environment, which is what you'll obviously get access to, and there's other resources there, like free videos, tutorials. There's a social bit where you can communicate with other students on a wall and ask questions and get some support. And you get that basically for 12 months after you finish the course as well, which is really good for that kind of support. You then get alumni aftercare, which means help and advice, getting your CV and showreel together. You can come and have a showreel clinic where we can help you put your final pieces of work you've done into a showreel. And that's supported for a period of time after the course is finished too. And you get free Autodesk software when you register with the Autodesk education community. So you get lots of access to the Maya, Mudbox and all the various software that Autodesk produce. So you can do your projects at home and you can bring those scene files into Escape and use those here. And it's that you'll hopefully use the primer course or just get a bit into it before you come. Anything you do before you come really accelerates your learning when you're here. But if you don't, it's not a problem. We teach everything from basic, and we have the patience in the first couple of weeks in order to get everybody up to speed. So let's talk about the content of the full-time course and also the part-time course. The part-time course, if you imagine sort of the weeks here, approximately, it's a slightly shorter course. We miss out some of the content in the later weeks because some of the content on the full-time course is more self-study. So we tend to do the less self-study on the part-time course because people only come in part-time in the evenings. You can do the self-study when you're not here. So rather than do it in the classroom time, we compress the lessons into that time. Whereas on the full-time course, it's stretched out. So that's why it's slightly longer. But approximately, you can think of 1 week of the full-time course equivalent of 2 nights of the part-time course. The first week basically is the introduction to Maya, where we're going to do some, in a minute we're going to look at Maya and I'm going to go through some of this just to reiterate how the interface works and how things move, and just to give you a taste on how we might teach it in the classroom. But we'll do that soon. So I will boot up Maya and we can have a look at that and see the interface. And if anybody's got any questions or anything they particularly want to see in Maya, just type it away in the message box there and I'll do my best to do that for you. On the first week, we basically do an introduction to Maya. The whole first week actually is introduction to pipeline in Maya, to be more fair. In each day, we look at a little bit of the pipeline. I've mentioned this word pipeline before. What that actually is the process that you do from nothing and you end up with a final clever bit of CGI imagery at the end. So generally the pipeline or process that we're involved in would be to start to model something, and that's to create the thing that you're obviously going to animate or move or look at. Once you've modelled that, the next part of the pipeline would be to texture it, which is painting it to make it look like or more like the object you want it to be. Then you put it into the environment and then you need to light it and shade it and render it in order that and those processes, obviously lighting is like a photographic studio where you pop the lights in there and you make it look nice. The rendering is basically like the digital camera. The rendering process is the same as pressing the shutter on a virtual camera, except the rendering process on a computer can take a few hours to generate that picture because it's processing all the clever way that light bounces around the scene. And that's what you set up with the shading and the lighting in order that the way the light might bounce off a mirror differently to how it might bounce off wood or plastic or a piece of skin, or to make hair look like hair. Or the petals of a flower to allow the light to come through them subtly, and all those kind of effects. And it's all that stuff that makes the rendering go slowly. So we introduce you to that bit of the pipeline in the first week. We don't do it in any great depth. It's just to help you understand how everything fits together. Our philosophy here behind the course is to let you see the bigger picture first, then we'll come back and fill in the details later. That way you kind of know where you're going when you're learning, and you kind of understand a bit more of what you're doing when you're doing it. it's much easier than moving around in the dark, I think. So we show you that whole pipeline. Then in the next few weeks we go back over each of those parts, individual parts of the pipeline, in much more depth. But all the while, you already know how that fits together in the bigger picture, and that should hopefully help make that bit more sense. You know, the first sort of day of this, we go through the user interface. If people have never used Maya before, again, it's not a problem. We go through what most buttons do and how to navigate and that kind of bit. So I'll give you a quick introduction to that shortly. The modelling, we just model something simple, and then texturing, we obviously apply simple textures, and then the lighting and rendering, we just see the final part of the process, which is putting the scene together. When we get into week 2, this is when we come back and we start looking at each one of those sections in more depth. Remember, modelling, texturing, lighting and rendering. So the next few weeks are looking at exactly those sections. So week 2, we'll be looking at modelling in more depth. So we start to look at more sophisticated techniques, things like using curves to generate topology. The reason we use curves is to generate nice organic looking shapes, and also build them when we say topology, we just want nice squares everywhere. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that wireframe drawing of 3D. We just want nice squares everywhere. And then we look at generating polygons as well. These are the different types of geometry you can create, NURBS and polygons. In a minute I might demonstrate what the differences between those are. And topological rules, which just means how the meshes fit together, how, you know, what's good and what's bad, and why things should work and why things shouldn't work. Again, I might demonstrate some of this theory in a moment. So then on week 3, again, we carry on looking at modelling in more depth. So here we start looking at organic modelling, where we look at sort of modelling a head and how that might differ from modelling, say, a car, a hard surface as we call it. Generally, it's split into these two disciplines, organic modelling and hard surface. Hard surface modelling is generally easier, but much more attention to detail, because there's a lot of bits and pieces. When we say hard surface, we mean anything that's not alive, you know, so machinery, basically machinery and furniture and buildings, that kind of thing. Organic modelling is obviously what it says on the tin, things like people, aliens, creatures, that kind of thing. There's actually a lot more work doing hard surface modelling than there is organic modelling. And to do organic modelling, or to be good at it, you want to do digital sculpting, and some people out there are just amazing at it. So unless you have those kind of skills, it's not really a good thing to push into. But we look at it because it's important to understand how the topology works, basically, for the rest of the pipeline, because you may be working with organic meshes, and if you've tried to build one, you'll understand the pros and the cons and the difficulties, which is a really good experience, I think. We then look at what's called UV mapping. This is in order to allow us to paint on the surface in a minute for the texturing, and it's a particular quirk of 3D that you don't have digital paint. So think of it like wrapping paper. So we show you all these techniques, how to create those for your organic or your hard surface models. And that brings us into colour and lighting. So the next week we look at setting up the environment. Now, this seems a bit strange doing the lighting before the texturing, before the painting, but generally not. It's quite a good idea to have a look at lighting first, particularly when you don't have textures, because by default in 3D, your stuff will be grey. And grey gives you a really good natural sense of the tone and contrast in an image, which is the basis of painting or anything. Then you can add all the colour later on. And often the textures can fool you when it comes to the lighting a bit. So what we tend to do is set up the lighting first, add the textures, and then tweak everything at the end. So we'll teach the lighting first, and we look at lighting theory because it is very, very important. So again, if you've got some experience of photography, that is really, really handy, because at the end of the day, most of visual effects is reproducing what the camera sees. With respect to 3D and images. So understanding how a camera works and the limitations of a camera would really, really help. But again, we teach that on the course. And we also teach traditional cinematographic and photographic techniques when it comes to lighting. Things like 3-point lighting and other theories of lighting, and also colour theory, which can help make your images look fantastic by adding depth and contrast and all those other lovely things. And then we look at different lighting scenarios, because the thing about 3D is you can't just say, do the lighting. You have to know what it is about particular phenomena in order to recreate them. For example, natural lighting. What makes up natural lighting? Well, it's quite simple, really. Natural lighting is outdoor lighting. If you think about it, outdoors we only have one big light source, it's the sun, and that's always coming down on your head. And then the sky itself is a very low bluish light. So if you had a very bright orangey light for the sun from one direction and a sort of a lowish bluey light to fill in the shadows, that would be a good representation for natural lighting. We also look at studio lighting in the same way. You know, what is studio lighting? So you can make an image that looks like it was shot by a professional photographer. Again, they use a technique called three-point lighting, and we go into detail with that on the course. And then we do things called indirect lighting techniques, and that's simulating how the light actually bounces around a scene, and that gives it that real natural look. And again, we'll explain the technical details behind that. Image-based lighting, again, another really exciting technique. This enables you to actually take photos of the environment that you want to copy the lighting from and actually use those photos to generate the lighting in 3D, which means you get a much, much better match. But again, sometimes that's not possible, and this is quite a recent technique. And for many years, we survived with the next technique, which is matching lighting. And that's the raw ability to look at a photograph, deconstruct the lighting that's there, and then reproduce that in 3D so that your object then looks like it was lit in the original scene. So again, we teach that skill because that's absolutely important, because a lot of the time you may not have been able to recover your image-based lighting from the scene. So it's a great skill to be able to just reproduce it just by looking at the photograph. So again, these are the kind of skills that we try and to develop while you're here. You know, really nice stuff. So you can come away and be that fully rounded artist. And again, this is the same for the part-time and the professional course. We're a firm believer if you get a strong foundation in there, everything you build on top of that is going to be rock solid. And then we talk a bit about more advanced lighting techniques, you know, things like soft shadows and ray trace techniques and little bits and volumetric shadows, and what that means is the shadows that you see in smoke and fog and all those fancy effects. So the more advanced techniques of creating natural lighting effects. So that's quite an exciting week, I think. I like lighting, you see. And once we have our objects and we've lit them nicely, we want to start to paint them. Obviously, if you don't have nice light, you can't see what you're painting. So with the painting, we have a little look at Maya's technique of Maya's interface of painting, which is the Hypershade and the Look dev environment. And then we say texturing masterclass. We go through an actual example, one of the models that you may have built earlier on. The reason I say may is that the tutors follow these concepts to teach, but sometimes they change the content of which they teach them around, which is fine. It keeps them fresh and exciting, and often they integrate new techniques and new parts of the software that may or may not have come out by the time that we've done some of the materials. So yeah, the texturing masterclass is generally we do a case study where you'll texture something, either an aeroplane or an old barrel, and you'll look at the process of making it look like metal and chipping the paint off where you want, making the textures look motivated. So for example, if it's a barrel, the scratches would be on the bits that stick out rather than the inner bits, you know, where it's rolled along the floor and worn away. So we talk about having a history and a story behind your texturing. You know, the reason a moss grows in a particular place, or on a door, the footmarks are always at the bottom where people kick it. They're not halfway up the door. Well, if they are, it suggests something completely different. We talk all about that in the texturing masterclass. It's not just about the technical stuff of how to paint it, but also the artistic reasons behind it to make it look natural and realistic. And obviously that's going to involve image manipulation. So of course we're going to teach basic Photoshop, and that's what we do with texture distressing, and that's making things like you might find off the internet of some wood and making that look like old wood or scratched wood, or some metal rusty or shiny in some areas but not others. And we teach in Photoshop particularly what we call non-destructive workflows. The thing is, when you work at home or on your own project, it's easy to save over the same file again and again and again. When you're in production, the problem is clients will often change their mind. So you need to be able to go back and make particular changes and then give them a new version. Now, if you work what we call destructively, as in overwriting bits, particularly in Photoshop, you can't go back easily and make small changes. You have to start again. So we show you techniques and ways of working so that if people make changes, you can do that quickly without having to do everything from the beginning again, which is a real time saver, particularly in production where time costs money. And, you know, it's just more professional ways of working. So, you know, we go into that quite heavily, which is always good. And then we look at this great technique called camera projection mapping. This is a way of using images and photos to quickly texture huge amounts of scenery and geometry, and it's the trick behind how we build massive environments very fast. Or we might extend a set and put a hole in a wall that was never there, or a crater in the floor that was never there, that kind of thing. Or you might have done your CG element. Again, I'll use the floor example. You might have a CG missile in the floor, so you can build the join where the ground's all ripped up and then it blends into the real photo or moving image. So camera projection mapping is the secret behind all of that. It can also fix textures, which is a bonus. So yeah, we have a look at those sort of techniques. Again, we don't, you know, because the course is so short, it's very intensive. We introduce these techniques. You get to do a project with both the part-time course and the full-time course. The whole point of it is that you come out with something to show on your showreel. For example, on the full-time course, you'll spend the mornings doing the theory and then the afternoons doing your project. And on the part-time course, you'll probably spend one day of the week doing the theory and then one day of the week doing the projects again with the tutor. The projects is where you can put all of this stuff that you've learned into practice, and that's the real learning. I'll give you a great analogy or an example. If I show you videos of riding a bicycle, it looks quite simple and straightforward and diagrams and all the rest of it, but you're not ever going to get good at riding a bicycle until you ride one, and then you realise how hard it is because you fall off lots. And only by riding a bicycle loads and loads and loads do you get better and better and better at it. And it's exactly the same with this stuff. You know, we can give you lectures and you can follow along to the lectures as much as you like. That's like watching, you know, videos of bike riding, but the actual riding on your own is doing your own project. That's when you're going to come across the real problems that you need to solve, and once you've done that, you're going to remember that exact journey so that you can reproduce that on your own again and again. So the projects for us is the real learning, to be fair. The lessons, we feel, is just where we give you that information and it's up to you to take that and do stuff with it, which is what the projects are for. So you can use all of these techniques or some of these techniques depending on what it is that you want to do. And hopefully at the end of it, with guidance from us, you'll end up with a nice piece on your showreel, and then we can put it on our showreel, and then I can show it to the next webinar like I did for you guys straight at the beginning here. Week 6, this is sort of the last week of the full-time course. So we're going to be looking in this stage at texturing and surface, more advanced texturing and surface techniques, things like displacement mapping, Maya nodes, ray tracing, reflections, refractions and shadows. So displacement mapping is where you don't model small details and you get the render itself to create those much later on. And you can use images to do that. So sometimes it's easier to paint all the lots of small details than it is to try and actually make it with your hands. And then you can let the computer generate it. So that's what display. I'll give you an example, a brick wall. Instead of modelling all the bricks, you can have a flat image and making it black and white image of the bricks, and then the computer will make all the bricks stick out like they would, and saving you all that work. So that's what kind of displacement mapping does. Ray tracing, that's how the light bounces around the scene in order to make things look real. We deal with photorealism here. We don't just sort of arty or that stylistic look. You can do that on your own. We teach particularly photorealism, which is very difficult to attain, but it helps you understand all the major techniques and things about image quality, and then you can start to subvert that to create non-photoreal, you know, more creative stuff if you want to. But generally, a lot of jobs out there are about photorealism, so we understand the properties of things like reflections and refractions. You know, reflections is the study of the way light bounces off surfaces, and refractions is the study of the way light penetrates through or travels through objects and things. And shadows is obviously where light gets blocked, so it doesn't go there at all. So we look at all these different properties of light. So good, let's have a little intro to Maya. So I'm going to spend sort of the next 10-15 minutes to have a quick look at what Maya is, or what 3D is even, as a more basic level, and understand sort of how we generate those surfaces, and then we might paint them, and then we might render them to create a final image. And then I've got a couple more slides after that, and then I'll leave sort of 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So this is Maya. Interestingly, Maya is the South American, here, let's have a look. Maya was the South American goddess that created the world and everything, allegedly. Yeah, the moon goddess. They believe she created the world according to Autodesk. But Maya lets us create all sorts of wonderful things. So this is the 3D environment, so which makes up the main part of Maya. Some of you may or may not be familiar with Maya or a 3D environment, so I'm just assuming people have never seen this before. And it's kind of like school, where you have graph and grids. We call this the Cartesian grid, or Cartesian graph, and we measure it. You're probably more used to seeing it in like graph paper kind of view like this. We have an x-axis and a y-axis, and if you look down the bottom corner here, my little cursor's circling it, this is what we call a gnomon, and you'll see we have a little x and a little y. and that's our corresponding axis. Now we look at that in 3D. Actually, if I tap the spacebar, you can see we can four what we call orthographic views. This is the top looking straight down. This is the front, and this is the side. Anyone that's done sort of technical drawing will kind of recognise this. And this here is our perspective or 3D view. And here we have our Y goes up, so this will be X and Z, or rather this is the X and this is the Z if we look at the little gnomon down here. Now, I don't know if you remember from school, but graphs are positive and negative, so plus goes in the direction of the little line. So this will be plus Z minus Z plus X minus X. So actually, if we look down the front, we'll be looking this way. So that's positive X and positive Y, like we were looking down the front view. So this is kind of how we orientate or get ourselves in 3 dimensions. Now, in 3 dimensions, this is not true at all. This doesn't actually exist. Oh, hello, I've got a question here. First, you can show the attribute editor. Second, scene assembly or set dressing. Oh, that's a little bit of advanced for the Michael. We could maybe do that in the My Advanced stuff, but I will talk a little bit about nodes and what those are, because this is the core part, and people may not appreciate what nodes are. What is a node? I'll explain in a minute. We'll get onto the more advanced stuff in the later webinar, which I believe is actually on the 22nd or 23rd. Let me just check which the date of that. Yeah, it's on the 23rd of January. So if you want to tune into that, we will talk a bit more about the attribute editor and the more advanced things. So yeah, thanks for that one, Ant. So yeah, do turn up for that, and I'll help you out. Then we will look basically at the nodes now. So there is no such thing as 3D. This doesn't really exist. This is a representation of a 2D image. This is a 2D image with a representation of a 3D space. We only ever create a 2D image, but this allows us to create the correct perspective and everything else. But you can think of it like 3 dimensions if you want. So how does it work? Well, we create dots, basically. The computer needs to remember things, so this is what we do. We work out the dots in a grid, then we join the dots, and we make lots of them, and then we create complicated things with that. But in order to define that object, we need to tell the computer about each dot in space. You can call those samples or points, or we actually call them vertices. So let me create a dot. No, not that dot. Let me create a dot. So if I create a dot, that's the simplest thing we can create in 3D space, a point with position. The next simplest thing we can create is 2 points, and with 2 points we can join a line together. Once we have a line, we can do stuff with that line. The next complicated thing that we can do with a line is, let me see if I can demonstrate this. Oh. Right, let's just, don't worry about that one. So, there we go. Is this as a dot? Is with 3 dots, or 2 dots or 3 dots, we can actually create what we call a polygon. There we go. Let's do it that way. So with 3 vertices, 1, 2, 3, we can actually create a plane between those. And this is down to some simple maths actually. If we do the, you can work out the plane to 2 vectors. We don't go into the vector maths, you'll be pleased to know. But with 2 planes we can create this polygon. So this is the simplest piece of geometry we can create. And this is called a triangle. And then we make lots and lots of triangles to make complicated objects. Now, let me see if I can get a more complicated object. Here is some sharks, some teeth. That's nice and complicated. So here's some teeth, a more complicated object. And again, you can see this is just made up of a bunch of points, each point representing the points of a plane, which we call a face. And then lots of these planes go together to make something more complicated, like say a pair of Dracula teeth. all very scary. And then we can move those points around in 3D and create what we call animations, which is again just the computer remembering the positions of these points over time. So if I tell the computer to remember the position of each one of these individual points here, I can go to a different time at the bottom here. This is the time slider. And I can move them to a new position. And I can tell the computer to remember that position. Ooh. So now when I move between the two times, it goes from one to the other. And then we create the animation. So it's all about these points. And that's all there is. And to prove to you what these points are in Maya, if we go to the, where is it? The attribute spreadsheet or component editor. Right, component editor. If we go to the component editor, I click on here, we can see actually, if we select one point, that point there is vertex number 292. And this is its world position. So it's in 4.2 along the x-axis, 1.5 along the y, or -4 along the z. In fact, if I want to send it back to 0, which is here at the center of the world, the origin, I can type in 0, 0, 0, and you'll see the point goes exactly there, which kind of ruins the beautiful look of it. But if you know the exact position of each point, you can create these interesting looking things. So again, it's all about points that create faces that create vertices, and etc., etc. And when you save the scene file, let me save the scene file. Let's just save it to there. When we save this scene file, just to again prove, let's see if we can open this up. This is the actual scene file that saves on disk, and if I scroll down, you'll see there's the list of points that make up these complicated objects. So all the computer knows is the dots, and then using clever maths, it joins the dots, it creates the shading. Once we have that, we can then change the position of the points over time, and then this is how we build up the whole stuff. Does that make sense to people? Is that good? Now, the way Maya keeps track of all this stuff is it uses what we call nodes. Let me show you something scary yet fun. I will bring up the node editor there for Ant just to have a look at it. We'll talk about the more scary stuff on the next webinar on the 23rd. So, in fact, that's a bit confusing at the minute. Let's use the outliner. These are various Maya panels. I'll explain what all these are on the course. This is kind of an overview of the different stuff in the scene. Now, you'll see that we have the different bits. There's the curve I drew. There's my teeth, lower and upper. And you can see I can select these things here. And if I open one up, you'll see there's two of these. Now, in this view, on the right here, you'll see we have lots of tabs. Now, let me show you another viewer. Yes, Maya has lots of viewers. And here we'll see, again, those things connected, very similar to the node editor. Now, actually, these are all nodes. If you look, I'm selecting the same thing. They're just different views of the same thing in Maya. So Maya's actually made of this. These are what we call nodes. If you like, a node is like a simple program that does a simple job. That way, we don't have to rewrite the same bit of code. And then these nodes link together like jigsaw puzzles, and they spread past the data. And it's like a flow diagram. By changing the order of these things, you can change different outcomes inside Maya. I'll give you an example. Here is our upper teeth. And you remember I animated it. So these nodes here remember the animation data for each of those of how I moved it. Now if we look, I actually rotated it along the x-axis. So I did a rotation on x. So if we look along here, we can see the data for rotation on x on this node. And look, we can see on frame 1, it was on this rotation. On frame 46, it changed. If we look at translate z, on frame 1, it was this, and on frame 46, it didn't change. So this one doesn't animate. In fact, I can delete all of those because none of those animate. This is the only one with the data in it. And look, it changed nothing. So nodes hold data, that data plugs into another node and does something with that data. If we look at this node, we'll see it now it's gone red here where this is plugged in. If you look, it says rotate X into teeth upper rotate X. So we plug the rotate X into the rotate X. So in other words, that animation data here, we plugged into the rotate X of our teeth, which is why it rotates along that axis. So we can do very, very cool stuff with these nodes. This node, incidentally, is called a transform node. This node moves all the points in one go. Think of it like a cardboard box. You wouldn't want to go in there and move each point one at a time, every single time, because that would be painful. So we put them in a container called a transform node, which allows us to move it all in one go. We can, as you saw, actually select all the individual pieces and animate them like this, but that would be painful. So the idea of a transform node, this top level node, is to move all the points. This second node under it is called the shape node. This node is actually what draws the teeth. And this is called a mesh node because this shape node makes meshes. And the meshes is the polygon. Now again, if I create a camera, you'll see a camera also has a transform node with a translate and a rotate, so we can move the camera around the world. But the camera's shape node is different. If you look, the camera shape node has all the properties of a camera, things like its focal length and its angle of view. Whereas a shape node for geometry is different because a geometry isn't a camera. So this has things like how we can display the individual components of the geometry, things like the centers of the faces or the normals. Also, how the surface looks and tessellates, and also how it might render. Whereas with a camera, we don't have any of that. We just have its focal length and angle of view and things that are to do with the camera. So if you notice, they both have a transform node which moves them around the scene. But they all have a unique shape node which defines the kind of stuff that we can move around a scene. And this is how Maya's put together these sort of reusable nodes. If I select the camera and the teeth, I can actually do clever stuff. Here's the camera's transform node. So here's some of the advanced stuff straight away. I can actually plug in the output of that animation curve into the camera. So if you look now, the camera's rotate X is also using this data. And now both the camera and the teeth move together because they have the same animation. We're sharing data amongst these nodes. And this is some of the power of Maya, how you can share data. If I change the movement of one, the other one's affected with it. And we can build these complex relationships. This is not rigging, but building complex relationships like this is how rigging works. And when I say rigging, it's exactly that. We rig lots of geometry like this together so that an animator moves one part, but a lot of things happen. So it's a lot easier for them to animate much more complicated things. For example, a tail swishing around. The animator will just animate the bottom of the tail, but you've built the relationship all with nodes and other clever things, so all the other bits of the tail move, and it gives that swishing nature. So there's another advantage to these nodes, which is really interesting. For example, let's create a sphere, so a round object. And let's have a look at the nodes again for a sphere. So here is our shape node. So this draws the geometry. But this time we get a node at the beginning. This is the creation node. This defines the geometry so that we could change its radius and also how it's drawn after the event. So after we've made it, we can change the options. You're probably thinking, so what? Who cares? That gets really useful when you might do something like this. Excuse the sharp teeth. So if we create something with a curve, something complicated like a pot. If we want to re-edit the shape of this, this could be tricky, but because of this nature of the nodes, I can re-edit the curve and it changes the shape that I generated from it. So that we can get a much more better idea on how that's going to look. Afterwards, obviously you can see the much more creative ramifications of working this way. And if we look at the relationship between these guys with these nodes, again, you'll see that we have here a curve. This curve is being revolved and tessellated to create this shape. And they're all plugged together. If I break this relationship, so delete one of the connections there, you'll see the surface fails to draw. If I break it there, I can still get it to draw, but look, I can move the points around and it doesn't affect it anymore. So the best thing to do is keep the relationship here between the nodes, and it allows you some very good animation possibilities, not just modeling possibilities. Look, it swallowed something. Something like that. So this is Maya's nodes, and they can be very, very powerful if used in the right way. It's not this, what we call, it is fairly destructive, but it's not such a destructive way. We can still have a certain level of flexibility here. For example, I may not have wanted to revolve it all the way, just have a quarter or half. We still have the history there. Or we could go the other way and just have a concertina, and look, we can still go back and change the curve and do stuff. So it's very, very cool, is Maya. Ooh. Quite impressive, I think, with that. Then we can do some nice, interesting things. For example, say we have a camera. Let's just get rid of that animation. I can look through the camera to frame the teeth. We can create some lights very easily using the Arnold renderer. So let me just pop in what we call an environment light. And I'm going to use that technique I mentioned of image-based lighting. So I'm going to pop in one that I've made earlier. So if I zoom out, you'll see this is a sphere of an environment with the sun in it. Now what's amazing about that, let me just create a ground to sit this all on. Let's just make that big so we can't see it off to the horizon. There we go. What's amazing about this is, if it doesn't decide to crash on us, that's the other thing, is that we get this lovely shadow and this lighting based on that photograph. And you might agree that does look quite nice. Let me just spin the light around 180 degrees so it's facing into our object. And that might look quite real. If anybody's seen old James Bond movies, there was a character called Jaws. He had metal teeth. So what I'm going to do is let's just do a quick Jaws effect. Let's we're going to create a special shader that works with this renderer. And then what we're going to do is, in order to make this look like, let's just use a Chrome preset for now. There we go. So it looks like Jaws. Actually, I don't like that. I'm going to just change the effect of it a bit, just to make it look a bit more satin teeth. There we go. So we've got shiny Jaws teeth. In fact, just to show you how the rendering might work, we can add another new material. So this is the shading. As you can see, it's fairly interactive, trying to update here as I'm doing stuff. So make a piece of glass there. Change the camera while it's working away. Now the background doesn't show up, don't worry about that. It's because in our production pipeline we add the background later. There are ways to get it to show up in here, but by default it doesn't, because professionally you don't, if that makes sense. Excellent. So there's a quick look at sort of Maya geometry, how that fits together, how we can move around a scene, even bringing it in, adding some cool lights, and then changing the materials. So we can have a metal or a glass material. In fact, anything that we want, if we know how to dial it in. I'll just make it look a bit smoother. There we go, we've got quite an interesting image of some alien fangs or something like that. Cool, so let me pop back to my slides for a minute. So I just want to mention how you can apply. Well, we welcome anybody to apply, basically. We don't mind looking at you, as long as you're over 18, you've got a good understanding of written and spoken English, otherwise you won't get much out of the classes, and you feel comfortable using a computer. You may not have necessarily have used one before, but just comfortable with the idea of using one. Obviously, if you've used one before, it is handy before you come to the course. Hopefully you would have done that intro course, the primer that I mentioned earlier. A working knowledge of Adobe Photoshop would be an advantage, but don't worry if you don't know anything about Photoshop. Again, we teach it on the course, but any prior knowledge would always help. So just, if not, just have a look at a demo of it and get familiar with it, so it's not a shock when you do open it up for the first time. Or come visit us. We'd love you to come and visit us. We have short course open evenings where we talk about the short courses. So if you come along to Escape in Shepherd's Bush on Tuesday the 16th, have a look on the website for further details. You can come and talk to us, talk to the tutors, talk to the admission staff, talk to some of the escapees, ask them what it's like. Is it good? Is it bad? Ask them, is the coffee good? They'll all say yes to that one. And we also do taster days. Taster days are good. You come along for the day and we teach you for the day. We do a little similar to what I've done tonight, a little introduction to the pipeline of modelling, lighting, texturing and rendering, but spread over the day, a little bit slower paced, so you get to see actually what it's like to sit in the classroom and be taught in that particular style. So if you're not sure about coming on a course, you can come and do a taster day and really get a feel for what it's like. And again, since you're there for the whole day, you can speak to other staff, other escapees that are actually on the course, see what it's like, see what their experiences are. You know, so this is a great way to interact with us and find out more yourself before committing to anything. So yeah, do come visit us. Come and see what it's all about. So if you want to make any inquiries, obviously we've got the admission teams here that you can give a call on during office hours, or send an email to them, or go on the website, of which there's plenty of contact information there too. So I think there's a few minutes here left at the end. So does anybody have any questions about sort of Maya or the course, or what you might want to learn here, or anything at all? About the nodes, all right, we've got one from Omar here. About the nodes, connecting nodes is like parenting, right? Yes and no. It's in reference to the transform node and the shape node, these two guys, it does look like parenting because you move one, the other one moves. That relationship you can think of as parenting, but actually nodes aren't parenting. What nodes are, think of them like a flow diagram of data. This creates some data, feeds that data into this. This does a particular process, changes that data and feeds the new data into this. So the process here would be this defines the curve. Let's see if we can do that. So this defines the curve. Let's zoom in there. No, we're not going to maybe be able to. Oh, there we go. I've hidden it. I'm the fool. There we go. So the first one here defines the curve. Okay, once we have that curve shape, this node here actually spins the curve around an axis, and you'll see it's called revolve, and it just takes that data of the curve and spins it for us. This node then works out, once it's spanned mathematically, how to turn it into geometry. It then feeds that information to this node, which then displays it for us. This node then takes, well, this is the node that actually makes it look grey. So this just actually draws the geometry more like this in wireframe. This node here connects the material to then shade it finally. So each one of these has a specific job. They're not like parent-child. You know, this just creates curves. You'll see the node is called a curve node. This is a revolve node, so it will revolve anything plugged into it, and it will create some geometry. Here we're changing the topology of that geometry, and this node here, the mesh node, draws it. Does that make sense? Can't give thumbs up on these things, I think, but does that make sense, Omar? Does that help? Cool, awesome. All right, some more tips in the node editor. Go on, Ant, you're pushing it. There's no problem there. So yeah, as you can see in the node editor, we can draw things together. So just to prove this again a little bit more to Omar, let me just draw a new curve. I think I'll make this the last question because we're running out of time. So let me just draw a new curve around the axis, something very bizarre. I don't know what this is. It's a random curve. So if I look at my node editor, here is my new curve. This is my old curve, and the old curve is generating the geometry here. Let me put the revolve back to 360 because that was more fun. So 0 and 360. There we go. So this original curve's plugged into the revolve. So like I say, it's just raw data. If I then open this up, I can see it's taking an input curve, and this one is taking the world space. So if I open this little fella up, we can do it this way, I can choose world space, and I can plug that into input curve. Now, this curve is generating that surface. Pretty cool, huh? So if I just switch it back to the other one, that one generates the surface. So we can very easily just rewire these nodes or plug them in without having to rebuild that. You know, I didn't have to revolve this and do all of those steps before. I could just plug that in to a new part of the network here. Is that good, Ant? Did that make sense? Excellent. Cool, I'm pleased, thank you. Okie dokie there. So I'll leave it with that. So we'll leave on the inquiries here. So yeah, there you go. This is obviously not how I teach the class, but there's the kind of detail and depth I like to go into. I like to explain things quite thoroughly to give you that basic understanding. That way you'll be able to build on that and start to do your own cool things. Hopefully I've given you an idea of how sort of cool Maya can be. As I say, on the next webinar, the 23rd, I will just go into more advanced Maya. So again, we'll have a little look at 3DE, maybe a bit more of the node editor if people request. Yeah, so we'll look into things in a bit more advance. So cheers guys, we'll speak soon. Thank you, bye-bye.